We're broadcasting to you today live from the Peace Operations Training Centre down here at the Australian Defence College in Canberra. The Peace Operations Training Centre is responsible for training individuals for deployment overseas as part of Australia's peacekeeping commitments. But more than that, it also trains a large amount of overseas members, officers and other ranks. Well, today we're broadcasting as part of the United Nations Staff Officers course, which not only has Australians from the Army, Navy and Air Force, but also has 16 members from 13 different countries attending. Of the Army's 5 core behaviours, one of them, ethical decision-making, is perhaps the most important, for it guides what we do and when we do it. Part of what we do is bound by rules of engagement, which comes from international humanitarian law. Additionally, in the countries that we operate, there are their own laws. Some are based on more secular Western notions, and some are the results of hundreds of years of religious and cultural development. Understanding both our own role in international humanitarian law and the societies we operate in are essential for us as soldiers. They're essential because we need to be ethical decision makers. Today you're going to hear 2 speakers from the International Committee of the Red Cross. One of them is the head of the ICRC representation here in Canberra. His name is Mr. Len Blazeby. We also have one of the top Islamic law experts in the ICRC based out of Geneva, Dr. Al Dawoodi. With no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Len.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Australian Defence College and the ADF more broadly for having the International Committee of the Red Cross along here today. Thanks for your attention today. I will be introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Ahmed Al Dawoodi, in just a short while. But before I do so, I thought I'd just quickly tell you a little bit about what we do here with the Australian mission of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So usually you'll find the International Committee of the Red Cross in conflict zones. Our mandate is to protect and assist those people who are affected by conflict. That's either civilians being protected, people who are being detained, those people who are injured or sick. We protect and assist those people who are affected by conflict in around 42 either conflict or conflict-like situations around the world. Places like Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, across the globe. But in Australia, our job is somewhat different. Usually, we're working in conflict zones where it's important for us to demonstrate our neutrality, our independence, and our impartiality. So to be separate from the conflict itself, to not have, as we would say in Australia, a dog in the fight, so remaining neutral in terms of the fighters who are undertaking the conflict. In Australia, we're not operational in that sort of a way. The work that we do here is to work with government, to work with academia, to work with think tanks, and to try to get into the media in order to have policy discussions so that people know and understand who the ICRC is, what we do, and how we do it, as well as to engage in certain policies on humanitarian issues that are dear to the ICRC and that have common interest. So we work a lot with the government through Home Affairs, through Foreign Affairs. We work with Defence. We do quite a lot with Defence here in Australia, particularly presenting at courses, but also helping with the planning and being involved in military exercises across Australia. So that's the type of work that the ICRC does here in Australia. Now I'll introduce our guest speaker. So Dr. Ahmed Al Dawoodi was born in Egypt, and he is the legal advisor for Islamic law and jurisprudence at the International Committee of the Red Cross. He also teaches at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law, or IHL, and Human Rights in Geneva, Switzerland. He teaches there a course on Islamic law of armed conflict. He has taught in Egypt, the US, the UK, the UAE, and Switzerland. He earned a PhD from the University of Birmingham in the UK, has a Master of Arts from Leiden University in the Netherlands, a Bachelor of Arts from Al-Azhar University in Egypt, and he's published more than 24 articles and a book chapter on Islamic law, and is the author of The Islamic Law of War, Justifications and Regulations. So with that introduction, I'd like to present Dr. Ahmed Al-Dawoodi.
It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you here today. I'm very excited about this intellectual exercise that I'll have to undertake with you today, and hopefully take you into a kind of an intellectual journey or an intellectual legal exercise that goes back not only 100 years ago, but literally 1,400 years ago, to see how classical Muslim jurists and military leaders deliberated the kind of questions that you encounter with today in making decisions about the protection of civilians and civilian objects. But before I go to this, I'll try to briefly introduce to you the topic of our discussion today, the Islamic law of war, why an institution like the ICRC engages on Islamic law of war, and what is Islamic law, and where we can study Islamic law of war or armed conflict. And the focus of the discussion will be on a number of Islamic humanitarian principles that more or less can relate to the current armed conflict as we speak now. And I guess some of you already have been in conflict situations in the Muslim context, and we will see how this could relate to some of your experience. Islam in general as a religion, or Islamic law in particular, plays a great role in the lives of the daily lives of the Muslim individual, but also states, but also as armed carriers, whether governmental forces or more particularly non-state armed groups. And any attempt to neglect the rule of Islamic law in these situations will be at our disadvantage. So we need to educate ourselves, as you try to do here. Simply, if we look at this map, it will tell us a lot about the current armed conflicts. And this shows why institutions like ICRC and others are interested to learn about the Islamic law of war. Simply, we see it here that 70% of the operations of the ICRC are focused in Muslim contexts. And a similar budget are focused as well in Muslim contexts. So 41% of the ICRC budget are focused in Africa. 30, according to the recent studies, here it says 30, but the recent statistics of the ICRC, 31% are focused in the NAME region, the Near and Middle East, and 16% in Asia and Pacific, and 8% in Europe and Central Asia, and the rest 5% in the Americans. But we can say generally that most of these regions, more or less, there is an interest in understanding the Islamic rules of war. The same for other organizations like the UNHCR. According to last year's statistics, 70.8 million are forcibly displaced worldwide, and 57% of them are focused in Muslim countries in the heart of the Arab and Muslim world, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and south of the Sudan. And the top hosting countries also include Muslim countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, Sudan, and Germany. So Islam and its impact does not only concern Muslim countries, but in some cases I feel the interest in Western capitals are far more than in Muslim countries. Simply as we speak now, out of the 1.7 billion Muslims living today, 1/3 of them live as minorities in non-Muslim contexts. They're speaking of, if we speak about India, about China, about the West, so there is also a growing interest in understanding Islam as a religion in general, but specifically the Islamic law of war in particular, if we speak about conflict situations. Usually when we hear the word, when we speak about Islam or Islamic law, people use the word Sharia. But in fact, the word Sharia refers only to a tiny percentage of what refers to Islamic law. I would say less than 5% of the totality of the Islamic law. But Islamic law students, when they study Islamic law, they study it under another discipline called fiqh. And fiqh is an Arabic word, means understanding. And this speaks volumes about the nature of Islamic law. It's about the process of the jurist to understand and interpret Islamic law, which means that we expect, or we have to expect, different interpretations and many cases conflicting ones. And this will confront us a lot when we speak about the rules of engagement. But if you want to do a research about the Islamic law positions regarding to particular issues, where can we find the Islamic law? Islamic law as a legal system started 14 centuries ago. So we find part of Islamic law in legal rulings developed by independent individual Muslim jurists throughout history. We find them in court judgments. We find them in legal maxims, a number of legal maxims developed by the jurists, and finally in fatwa literature. And as you can see here, the definition of fatwa as adopted by the Encyclopedia of Islamic Law, a non-binding legal opinion developed by jurists. Because normally when we hear the word fatwa, we assume that this is a non-binding legal opinion. It's important as well to have a quick look at the sources of Islamic law, which is usually divided into two major categories: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources, in terms of hierarchy, the Quran, the Sunnah or tradition of Prophet Muhammad, and number three, the consensus or the consensus of the Muslim jurists. But yes, these are the primary sources. But if you take the first one, the Quran itself is not a legal document per se. It addresses a number of legal issues, but out of the 6,600 something verses, the scholars disagree. At best, they say 500 verses relate to legal issues. Most of them related to marriage, divorce, inheritance, but in some cases related to the law of armed conflict as well. But the point is, the Quran itself, or understanding the meaning of the texts, even the meaning of some words, is sometimes difficult for the average Arab speaker, university graduate, because the language is difficult, the language is complex, let alone understanding the situations to based on them legal rulings. So this means that we can find a degree of different interpretations about Islamic legal positions. And the same when it comes to the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, because there are literally hundreds of thousands of reports attributed to Prophet Muhammad. And the first challenge that we encounter is the authenticity of these reports. So there are hadith specialists or specialists in this field who categorize them in terms of authenticity, from the highest level of authenticity until fabricated ones. So again, if you want to build a position about a particular issue, we have to ensure that you discuss it also from whether it's authentic or not, but understanding the context in order to build a decision on this. When it comes to the consensus of the jurists, there is also disagreement whether it is possible that we have the consensus of the Muslim jurists throughout history or throughout different parts of the world about a particular issue or not. But again, Islamic rulings would have more weight if it has this kind of consensus. The second category, which is the secondary sources, the first one of them is analogy, public interest, custom, and the rest of these sources, gives us here the indication that all of these sources, there are rooms for interpretation, there are rooms for, number two, for flexibility and change of Islamic legal positions, but even there could be different positions from one scenario to another, or from one place to another. So this is all of this to come to the conclusion that the description of Islamic legal system as a religious or a divine legal system is a myth. In fact, according to one of the top Islamic law experts, have said that more than 95% of Islamic law, you find different interpretations and sometimes contradictory opinions. And this is one of the challenges that we face when we come to the application of Islamic law. This takes us to who adopts Islamic law. We have three main sects in Islamic law: the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Ibadis. The Sunnis are the majority of about 90%. Shia is about 9%, and Ibadis less than 1%. The Sunnis, we have four schools of law. The Hanafi, you find them in Turkey, in the Balkan area. You find them in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in India. The Malikis in North and West Africa. The Shafi'is in Southeast Asia, and Hanbalis in the Gulf countries. The Shiites mainly that have three main schools of law. The Twelfers mainly in Iran and Iraq. Zaydis in Yemen, and Ismailis in Pakistan, and a minority also in Canada, Australia, and some other European countries. And finally, Ibadis are in the Sultanate of Oman, tiny minority in Tunisia, Algeria, and Zanzibar. This again takes us to the conclusion that there might be different interpretations among the different schools of law. And this is a Wikipedia map which shows where these different schools are. But this is a very interesting tool developed by University of Ottawa, which shows the major legal systems in the world today, where we are concerned here about Islamic law, where Islamic law is implemented. But if you go to this tool, you will find that in the greatest majority of the Muslim majority countries, there is an amalgamation of different legal systems, with the exception of three countries, according to this tool, which are Saudi Arabia, the island of the Maldives, and Afghanistan, and previously Afghanistan, who they apply solely Islamic law. The rest of the Muslim countries use amalgamation of either civil law and Islamic law, or common law and Islamic law. And Islamic law for them is used mainly when it comes to family law: marriage, divorce, inheritance, custody, and so on and so forth. And this, to conclude this part, so Islamic law is a legal system that is alive in the modern world today. It is applied mainly in the court systems when it comes to family law, but still we have armed carriers, specifically today, many non-state armed groups who use Islamic law as their only source of reference, and they are only willing to abide by Islamic law as their source of reference. So now we will start this kind of ancient intellectual journey to these 8 principles of the Islamic law of armed conflict, and we will see here that early classical Muslim jurists, even from the time of the Prophet, deliberated and developed legal rulings on the issues of the protection of civilians and non-combatants, the prohibition of indiscriminate weapons, and the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the protection of property, the prohibition of mutilation, and the treatment of prisoners of war, aman, or what's called safe conduct and quarter, and finally, human dignity is also one of the principles that must be observed in armed conflict. Here we find 5 specific categories here listed by name, and we have also, I wrote the Arabic equivalent, where we have a clear-cut instructions from the Prophet Muhammad prohibiting targeting any of these categories. Number 1, women, children, the aged, the clergy, and another category called al-usafa. In many of my engagement and presentations like this to Arab audience, which includes sometimes lawyers or judges or some of the military, some of these Arabic words are unknown to them, because these are words that very archaic, used 1400 years ago, but they are very pertinent to the current armed conflict and could save many of the lives today. As a rule, all these categories cannot be targeting their hostilities, but also if any of them engage in fighting, so they can be a legitimate target. But now, even classical Muslim jurists deliberated the issue of the indirect participation in hostilities. But what if a woman is an actual fighter in the arms of the enemy? Now she becomes a legitimate target. But what if she indirectly participated in hostilities? And in classical Islamic sources, in the 7th century sources, they deliberated a number of interesting scenarios. Like, for example, what if the woman is the queen of the enemy and she came to the battlefield? Can she be targeted? Because in this case, if she is targeted, this is the rationale that then war would come to an end. And then you will not continue the fighting. The other case is, what if a woman is a wealthy businesswoman and she purchases the weapons to the army? So if you target the woman in this case, the enemy will be unable to fight. Or what if the enemy does not actually fight, but she patrols the enemy troops? Can she be targeted in this case? Another very interesting case, what if you find in the battlefield a hermaphrodite, somebody you cannot distinguish whether this is a male or a female? All of these scenarios to say that there was a fully developed doctrine on the prohibition of targeting non-combatants. And the same scenario with the children. But one of the first questions, how can you define a child? And we are struggling with this in many delegations in the Muslim contexts. We recently published a co-authored article with a colleague of mine on the protection of children under IHL and Islamic law, where a number of challenges that the ICRC delegations are encountered with, and the issue itself of identifying the age limit of children. Luckily, we have a hadith or a tradition from the Prophet where it sets the limit at the age of 15, because one of the Muslims wanted to volunteer to fight at the age of 14, and he was rejected, and he came the year after and he was accepted at the age of 15. So this is an argument that could be used with many non-state armed groups to set the limit at the age of 15. I remember in one of the Southeast Asian countries, I was given a presentation about this, and when I said that the age limit in Islam is 15, and he told me, but in our society here, we have young children who take up arms at the age of 9. Why is it possible that we can use this can be used? And now it's convincing when they see that in Islam itself, or the primary sources, that there are hadiths prohibiting the enlisting children prior to this age. So it is one of the sources of enhancing or respecting these kind of rules. The same with the aged. But what if an old person brought to the battlefield to arrange the strategy or the tactics for engagement for the enemy? And they discussed this based on an incident that took place during the Prophet's lifetime, where an old person called Durayd ibn Summa was brought to the battlefield, and the sources said he was over the age of 80. Can he be targeted in this case? So again, there is an ongoing deliberation about whether this is permissible or not. And if we go to the fifth category, al-usafa, which could be translated as anyone who is hired by the enemy to do supporting services in the battlefield, but they do not engage in active fighting. And the examples that they have at this time is somebody who takes care of the property of the enemy or takes care of the animals. So again, there is a prohibition on targeting them. If we use analogy, one of the secondary sources of Islamic law, so in modern war situations, this OSAFA category applies to healthcare, to reporters, to medical services, because they do not engage actively in fighting. And unfortunately, we had some of our colleagues who lost their lives last year and many others before by Muslim non-state armed carriers. But again, the problem is that they do not know about these specific prohibitions targeting these categories. So this is one of the quick examples to relate these ancient deliberations on the rules of engagement that are actually pertinent into the modern engagement. And in fact, we are engaging now with certain contexts where we are making progress in passing these key messages and training for some non-state armed groups with the objective that they develop codes of conduct based on Islamic law, because this is the only source of reference that they are willing to abide by, but at the same time does not violate IHL. We already all know about some of these non-state armed groups who already have their own codes of conduct, like the Taliban, for example. They have their own Laiha many years ago. Many other non-state armed groups, like in the south of the Philippines, they have also their codes of conduct, and in other situations as well. This could be something that could put some restraints on certain rules of engagement. All of this, I said that we have clear-cut instructions from the Prophet. And based on understanding the rationale of prohibition of targeting these categories, the jurists of the 7th, 8th centuries developed other categories like the ones we see here. All of this proves beyond a doubt that there is a doctrine related to the protection of civilians and non-combatants in classical Islamic law. So again, this is an image from an ongoing situation in the heart of the Arab and Muslim countries, and all of this could have been saved if these rules were respected. Also, it is very interesting to see some restrictions on the means and methods of warfare. In their primitive war situations in the 7th century, they were deliberating the permissibility of two specific weapons, mangonels or catapults, and this is behind this is the image of catapult or mangonels, and poison or fire-tipped arrows. Why? Simply because of their indiscriminate effect. So in the non-one-on-one fighting situations, so the Muslim soldier would have to use this catapult and put here fire or big stones and throw them at the enemy. And why they were deliberating this? Because in this case, you cannot be sure whether you will hit a civilian or a combatant. So they were deliberating whether this is permissible or not. The same with poison or fire-tipped arrows. If poison-tipped arrows fall in the water of the enemy, it could be a weapon of mass destruction. So is it permissible to use it or not? So we find an interesting deliberation and discussion between the Muslim jurists on this. We find that those who permit the use of mangonels, they permit it only in the case of military necessity, just like the case when the enemy fight from behind strongholds or big castles, and this is the only way that you can shoot at them. So they justify it only because of the case of military necessity. When they deliberated poison or fire-tipped arrows, some prohibited it because there is no precedent in the Prophet's lifetime. Some prohibited it because of pragmatic considerations. They say that the enemy could shoot them back at us. Some prohibited because it could lead to indiscriminate killing of civilians. It's very interesting also to see that they deliberated the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, like the case of night attacks and shooting at the human shield. And these specific two scenarios are used as we speak now by certain non-state armed groups to justify what you call terrorist acts. Why? Because here, why the jurists deliberated the night attack issue? Because if you shoot at the enemy during the night in the 7th century, there is no advanced weapons, there is no electricity, so you cannot be sure whether this will hit a civilian or a combatant. When it comes to the issue of the human shield, of course, taking human shield is prohibited in Islam, but they were deliberating whether it is permissible in two cases: if the enemy take their women and children, i.e. their civilians, as human shield and shoot from behind the human shield, like this scenario. This is an enemy taking a woman and child as a human shield and shooting at the Muslims. Is it allowed now to shoot at the enemy? Most likely you will hit the woman or the child. Or the other scenario, if the enemy take Muslim prisoners of war, is it allowed to shoot at this case? Very rich intellectual discussion between those who totally prohibit it, between those who allow it because of the case of military necessity, under the condition that you aim to shoot as much as you can the enemy combatant and avoid as much as you can the civilians, and if any casualty took place, this is only justified because of the military necessity, and if it happens, it's just as a collateral damage. These two tactics are justified now to use to kill people in in markets and others, and there was a book published by somebody with the name of the Abu Yahya al-Libi. He was from Al-Qaeda, where he spoke about the issue of al-tatarruz, justifying the use of indiscriminate attacks, where Osama bin Laden wrote a treatise in response of this, and it is available online both in Arabic and English, where he was rejecting Abu Yahya al-Libi's use of the issue of tatarruz to justify these kind of terrorist acts, and accusing him of betraying the cause of jihad because this is he is overusing it, and this leads to discrediting their cause. We find also a number of principles and instructions on the protection of property, and also when it comes to mutilation, there is clear-cut prohibition on mutilation, although some of the jurists also justify it in case of reciprocity, or if this would lead to the defeat of the enemy, despite the fact that there is direct, clear instructions from the Prophet and other Muslim authorities. When it comes to the prisoners of war, we find total agreement when it comes to the treatment of prisoners of war during captivity, like they have the right to shelter, to be treated humanely, to offer food, and all of this. But there is a problem when it comes, or a conflict between IHL and Islamic law on the position on termination of captivity, because Muslim jurists find different precedents in Islamic sources and early Islamic history, and one group say that the Islamic position is to release them freely or in exchange for Muslim prisoners of war or ransom. Others give the Muslim authority the right to choose from different scenarios based on what serves the best interest of the Muslim states, whether to execute all or some of them, or to keep them, enslave them in the Islamic territories and to pay ransom, because if they go back to their home country, they will come and fight us again. Some would say that they have to be exchanged freely or for ransom. So there are different conflicting opinions, and some army carriers could relate to any of these, and the problem here to execute some of the prisoners of war. But it's important here that we examine why the Islam allows, or those who have this reading, to allow executing some of the prisoners of war. When we study this, we find that this is based on the execution of 3 specific individuals in early Islamic history. But why these 3 specific individuals were singled out from the rest? According to our research, we find that this because they committed certain crimes and does not have to do with the fact that they were competent. Otherwise, others would have been killed as well. Finally, this is also discuss a very important issue related to the Islamic law of armed conflict called the Aman. Literally means protection, but here it refers to 2 different systems. One is safe conduct, And we have an image here of the ICRC president with the foreign minister of the Republic of South Korea. And this is what's called headquarters agreement, whereby they agree on the ICRC presence and work in this Republic of South Korea. And in Islamic law, we have this system, and even it predates Islam. Even in the Arab culture before Islam, anyone who wanted to enter the state or a territory for non-fighting purposes, to visit a family or for trade or for tourism or for education, they are granted this aman. And in fact, ICRC in many conflict situations, we get from certain interlocutors aman to work in some specific situations based on this system. And here, this relates to quarter, where if an enemy combatant asks for a quarter during the combatant, whether verbally or in writing or through a gesture, then according to Islamic law, they cannot be targeted. They have to be protected until they go back to their own home country. If they come back to fight, then they can be targeted. And finally, we find that human dignity also exists in armed conflict, and this is focused more on the management of dead bodies, where we engage a lot, or we use Islamic law a lot with the forensics units at the ICRC, where they are confronted with lots of challenges and questions regarding the proper and dignified management of the dead bodies. And because of the time, we don't have enough time to focus on this, but this is a very successful example of the cooperation between the Islamic law of armed conflict and addressing a number of these operational challenges that we face in the field. Finally, what I wanted to conclude here is that these classical Islamic legal deliberations is a specialization in its own. It does not mean that every Muslim is Islamic law expert. It does not mean that every Islamic law expert is expert on the Islamic law of armed conflict. So, because there is always the misconception that you are a Muslim, you can do Islamic law. It is the equivalent like if you meet somebody from Geneva and you assume that this person is a Geneva Conventions expert. It is not like this. So this is why we have and appreciate this meeting, because we have a lot to educate ourselves, and in order to be able to have the same job of IHL through different means, which is Islamic law, when it is relevant. Thank you so much.
I'm going to start with a question which has come in from Corporal Britton from 145 Signal Squadron. And it comes back to your talk about within Islamic law discrimination and not being indiscriminate. Corporal Britton asks, regarding the indiscriminate means of conflict, how does the use of remote detonated IEDs or vehicle IEDs or human IEDs fit in, which has been used widely by people claiming to be highly in line with Islamic law? How does that come into Islamic law?
So the main approach when we discuss these Islamic rules of engagement, that we focus on the early Islamic war situations, and then we develop these humanitarian or these principles. And these principles focus more on generally two things: the protection of civilians and the protection of civilian objects. So you can relate this to a situation where if there's a deliberate targeting of civilians, so this, of course, this will be prohibited in Islamic law. The gray area generally refers to the scenarios where this is justified by the military necessity. And this is left to anyone to decide. From different situations, we see that certain armed carriers, they have their own interpretations of who is a civilian and who is not. In some cases, in certain countries, even some non-state armed groups justify the targeting of judges, and specifically military judges. Why? Because they execute their mujahideen, because they get instructions from the government or from certain Western countries. So again, if any kind of such modern scenarios, we have to judge it according to these Islamic principles and whether this could be permissible or not. Under the discussion of these Islamic legal principles, we find that there is, as we have said, that there is clear-cut doctrine and understanding of not even jeopardizing the lives of civilians and combatants unless this is absolutely dedicated by the military necessities.
Thank you. And that leads me on to a question from Warrant Officer Class 1 Andrew Gehrig from Headquarters DCSTC. He asks, does Islamic law recognize higher law? So does it recognize the Geneva Conventions? And are there Islamic countries who are signatories to the Geneva Conventions?
Very excellent question, because we don't have the time to refer to all of this, but the answer is all the Muslim countries, with no exceptions, ratified the Geneva Conventions. This is one hand. The other problem, the problem is that you can find some non-state armed carriers who even they do not acknowledge their own government. But from within, the answer from within Islamic law itself, that any treaty, and there is a legal maxim related to this, المسلمون عند شروطهم ما لم يحلل حرام أو يحرم حلال, i.e. Muslims abide by the terms of their agreement unless it involves transforming something from a permissible into prohibited and vice versa. So in brief, that Muslims, and in many Quranic verses, Muslims are commanded to abide by their agreements. So then all the Geneva Conventions becomes compulsory and obligatory on the Muslims to abide by them. And this is all the governmental forces in the Muslim countries universally accepted. The only problem is with certain non-state armed groups who only take Islamic law as their source of reference. They are even unwilling even to listen to a discussion where IHL or even the mere fact of the emblem of the cross exists in the room, or any material that even includes the cross. So this is why we have this image, because we can use, let's say, use Nokia to make the same function of Apple. So in this case, we can use Islamic law to save people's lives, which is enriched in IHL.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Stu Baldwinson, who's the commanding officer of the Army School of Health, asks, when jurists are debating these aspects of Islamic law, and other scholars are debating, and you spoke at length about how only a small amount actually is in the Quran and from the Prophet, but a lot is come from scholarly debate. How much does the time period between the Quran and now get factored into the understanding today of Islamic law? A lot of, if you look in the Christian world, a lot of the laws which were 1,400 years ago are well and truly being replaced now by more secular rules. And yet there still seems to be this holding on to what was written so long ago. How do modern scholars come up with that issue of time?
This is why it was important to take you quickly into some slides about the current applications of Islamic law in some Muslim countries. And I said that only 3 Muslim countries at the present that use solely Islamic law. So mainly Saudi Arabia and the island of the Maldives. So the majority of the Muslim states use amalgamation of Islamic and non-Islamic legal systems. This has left the current state of the Islamic legal system in sometimes what I call schizophrenic situation. Because in one hand, you find that people are willing to or motivated to abide by Islamic law, but at the same time, they do not update these Islamic laws. So this is why there is a call from Muslim jurists and scholars to do ijtihad, i.e. new rethinking of these Islamic legal positions. And now they are calling not for the ancient, individual, independent Muslim jurist deliberations, but they call now for ijtihad al-jama'i, or collective ijtihad, i.e. in legal bodies, which has people from different expertise, because if you are debating these issues, you cannot debate it alone with a jurist. You need to have a military in the room to explain the scenarios, situations. Or if you are speaking about a medical issue, you need only not a jurist, but also a medical doctor. And the same with Islamic banking. You need a banker, because this is also a very flourishing part of Islamic law. Many international banks, Western banks, they have also what's called Sharia compliant banking system. And in their board of the Sharia, they have Islamic law experts, but they have also bankers to deliberate these situations. So the answer is that, as I said, this is a situation that we are confronted with. And now I think Muslim jurists and Muslim educational institutions need to examine and discuss and deliberate on these issues, because some other entities are already using them.
Brilliant. And that leads me nicely into the next question, which is from Major Callum Muntz at the 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment. We've just talked about looking back 1400 years. He says, will the recognition of the space and cyber domains of warfare, developing a legal and ethical framework for operations inside them, that's going to be difficult at best. Is the Islamic world looking at what the ancient principles mean for these new emerging domains?
When it comes to cyber warfare, this is of course a very pertinent and important issue for institutions just like the ICRC. But I would say that from the deliberation from the Islamic legal and ethical perspective, this is not an issue that's being deliberated yet. The other issue, which is also very important and unfortunately is not deliberated enough, is also the issue of weapons of mass destruction, despite its importance. But Muslim jurists are not deliberating in these issues in the contemporary war situations. But there are certain reasons for this, and this also relates to one of your previous questions, that many Muslim scholars are not deliberating or examining or studying these issues as they should be, because of certain cultural situations in the Muslim countries. And sometimes I say it like this: unfortunately, you find some Western institutions like for example, the Department of Defense, on some military colleges in the West, they are examining these. They have courses and training manuals on the Islamic law of armed conflict. I was in Washington last October, and I was in the Department of Defense, and they are reviewing their SafeCast training module, and they included a training module on the Islamic law of armed conflict to discuss these Islamic principles. This we do not have in the military in many, as you know, in many Muslim countries. So from a pure pragmatic and practical considerations, we have no choice but to do what you are doing now, to study and see how these principles, when relevant, can be used to save people's lives, including our lives as humanitarian workers.
Excellent. I'm going to combine two questions if I can here now. So Sergeant Nikki Roberts from the Army School of Health asks, who are Muslim jurors and what makes an individual eligible to be a Muslim juror? And the second question, which comes down to roles of peacekeeping, is I've been asked, when people are on operations, a lot of this knowledge you've said lies with those Muslim jurors. How much can we expect on the ground a local leader or an elder to know, vice an Islamic juror? Because quite often in our training we're told to engage with the leaders and engage with the tribal elders, but how much of this will they actually know, or do we also need to find who these jurors are?
You see, very interesting questions, and the first one we received also in one of our meetings today about the Muslim jurists. And as one of the leading Western Islamic law experts refers to Islamic law as its Islamic law is a jurist-scholar law system, i.e. it was developed by the jurists who belonged to the different schools of law, as I referred to. So they are supposed to be trained in a number of Islamic studies disciplines, and then with a focus after this on Islamic law. So for example, you cannot be a Muslim Islamic lawyer without understanding a number of disciplines related to Quranic studies, the Quran, another discipline called interpretation or exegesis of the Quran, another discipline related to Hadith or the literature of the Prophet, another discipline relates to Sirah, or i.e. the biography of the Prophet, the early Islamic history, and a number of disciplines even related to Arabic language, because you cannot understand or develop laws without understanding the language that is in the Quran or in the Hadith of the Prophet, even from a linguistic perspective, but also from a historical perspective, let alone from the context. So even when understanding the Quran, one of the disciplines is called context of revelation. You cannot understand a text or develop a law based on it without understanding the context itself. So this is why they have to be, in a word, Islamic law professors. And this is why in early Islamic history, these Islamic law professors wanted to be independent from the government. And this is why many of them refused to be judges. And actually some of them were put to jail because they do not want to be associated by the government, so they do not have to follow certain government positions. If this quickly answers the first question briefly, and the second one, it's a very important one as well, where these Islamic or Muslim religious leaders have great impact and influence upon the average Muslims, and specifically army carriers, if they have this kind of respect and if they see these religious leaders as neutral and independent and not, as they describe them, puppets of the government. So these religious leaders, as I said, it depends on their area of specialty. It does not mean that, again, every Muslim scholar is also a specialist in this area of expertise. And in fact, the area of the Islamic law of armed conflict, or the Islamic constitutional law in general related to the government and forms of government, is two of the very sensitive issues for Muslim scholars, because it could have certain implications with the regimes if they advocate certain Islamic positions regarding to their forms of government, but also when it comes to politics in general, these are very sensitive issues. So again, for some international organizations, without reference to by names, they engage with religious leaders. They encourage them to issue statements or fatwas related to some violations on the rules of engagement, and it's very effective. As you know, in the case of Iraq, for example, Imam Sistani, he issued a fatwa which was very respectable by the armed carriers in Iraq, which saved many of people's lives. And if this is done by other religious leaders, it could have a great impact on the behavior of armed carriers.
When it's not done, though, it can be disastrous. Lieutenant Blake Stretton from the Army School of Health has asked, and noting that Syria was run by the Ba'ath Party, which was notably quite secular, but how does the Syrian government of 2016 during the civil war justify the intentional targeting in Aleppo of a school and other nearby buildings before destroying the Al-Quds hospital, which was specialized in pediatrics and was supported by Médecins Sans Frontières, in clear violation of IHL? It is an Islamic country. That's a clear violation of everything you've just spoken about. How can it justify it?
But the answer is already in the question. Number one, because of my affiliation with the ICRC, we do not refer to specific, as you know, specific cases or states or even non-state armed groups by name, as you know. But the question itself, it says it's a secular Ba'athist regime, which does not use Islamic law or refer to Islamic law at all. So this is the answer itself.
Okay. That's a very simple answer. I've got one final question then before we finish up. That was outstandingly well answered. If you look at, for example, with international humanitarian law, ICRC and other organisations, when people break international humanitarian law, there is a mechanism for holding people to account, be it tribunals at The Hague or special tribunals set up for areas of the world following cases of genocide, etc. In Africa, for example, there's the African Court of Justice and Human Rights. Europe famously has a European Court of Human Rights. What mechanism is there in Islamic law or in the Islamic world to hold to account those people who don't hold to Islamic law?
Again, another very excellent question, and we received it also in the radio interview a couple of hours ago. Here we have two issues. We have Islamic law, we have the Muslim countries. We were speaking about the Muslim majority countries. We are members of the international society now, and of course we have the modern court systems, and it depends on the national legislations whether they allow for to be part of the International Criminal Court or not. So they have the mechanisms in their national system just like any other state. But what we are concerned with here about the case of Islamic law, and it is interesting here that in the case of Islamic law, it started, and these rules actually as developed in the 7th century. There was no Geneva Conventions, there was no United Nations. So the question is why the Muslim jurists developed these rules. The question is they developed these rules unilaterally, regardless of the behavior of their enemies, because they wanted to regulate the use of force in a manner that does not please the Almighty God. So they do not want to violate these rules, and this is one of the characteristics of Islamic law and one of the advantages of the use of Islamic law, because you start with a self-imposed system. If they believe in it, so they impose it on themselves. So this is one aspect, that you have the self-imposed system because of the reward in the hereafter. But in Islamic law as well, any kind of these violations, they have to report it to the court, and the judge have different mechanism when it comes to Islamic criminal law, 3 different categories where the judge can prosecute those who violate this norm. But unfortunately, and this is one of the, it's a good question, because in Islamic law, there is a law form when it comes to the sanctions or the punishment for those who violate these rules of engagement. In fact, there is no specific punishments for those who violate the law. But this does not mean that these punishments can go unpunished, these violations can go unpunished, because under the part of Islamic penal code called the ta'zir or precautionary measure, the judge have the authority to put or to give any punishments commensurate with the violation itself. But again, this was not developed, and as we speak now, there are some of the cases in the International Criminal Court where some Muslim non-state armed groups, they have Sharia court systems, and they adjudicate cases, and they impose certain punishments. So this is an example of where, if Islamic legal bodies of learned Islamic experts, they do not fall in these gaps, so we have already some non-state armed groups who are dispensating justice, and it does not mean in a matter that apply with Islamic law.
Thank you very much. I invite you all to thank Dr. Dawoodi. Thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today around Australia for this presentation. Remember, ethical decision making is one of the key 5 combat behaviours of the Australian Army soldier. It's something that you should be able to master regardless of where you find yourself soldiering around the world. Just a quick announcement, the COVAP was launched over Christmas, so regardless of whether you're on Android or whether you are on Apple, you can download COVAP, from either Google Play or from the App Store. That puts PME straight on your phone, straight into your pocket, and you'll get notifications every time we release a new article. So I encourage you to do that. I also encourage you to write for us. The Cove is your resource. It is your platform for trying to change the Army. We're always after your good ideas, and my editorial team will work with you to put your idea across in the best possible light. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining us here at the Cove, the home of the Australian Profession of Arms.